Evelyn Zumaya reads AffairsValentino.
I am Evelyn Zumaya, the author of AffairsValentino, and I want to read my book to you. Page 143, Chapter 8, The Whole Truth. Los Angeles, 8 years later in the spring of 1930. Unlike his famous namesake, Rudolph Valentino Coppola did not live a single day. Upon his death, the stillborn Rudolph Coppola's grief-stricken parents filed a malpractice suit against their obstetrician. During the opening day of the court's proceedings, baby Rudolph's mother, Angelina Coppola, took the witness stand to deliver her heart-rending replies to a line of questioning from the obstetrician's defense attorney. Angelina Coppola was overcome with emotion at several points during her testimony, and this prompted the judge to halt the proceedings to give the woman time to dab her eyes and take a sip of water. It was during one of these pauses that a young woman seated in the courtroom jumped to her feet. Before a stunned courtroom, she yelled out, "I have been sent to protect you, Angelina Coppola. I have been sent to protect you, Angelina Coppola." The woman then rushed forward towards the witness stand. The judge demanded order, while a bailiff restrained the shrieking woman. Despite the bailiff's heroic efforts, as he wrestled the woman out of the courtroom, she railed on for all to hear. "Last Christmas Day I was guided by the spirit of Rudolph Valentino, and I found Mrs. Coppola weeping at her son's grave. Rudolph sent me here today under the spell of his master guide, Blackfeather." As the bailiff dragged the woman towards the courtroom doors, his captive dug in her heels, rolled her eyes, and ranted in a language no one understood. The only intelligible words in her tirade which she repeated again and again were, "Rudolph Valentino." The woman was later identified as spiritualist and medium Shelley Royan Vier. Although Miss Vier was never heard from again, many people present in the courtroom that day later admitted her claims caused some degree of spine tingling. Even the most skeptical found it difficult to dismiss the unsettling notion that the spirit of Rudolph Valentino guided the medium to find Rudolph Valentino Coppola's mother at her tiny son's grave on Christmas Day. News of the infant Rudolph Valentino Coppola's death did not merit front-page coverage in the L.A. Times in the spring of 1930. Instead, the headlines announced Babe Ruth's freshly inked contract with the New York Yankees, details of outlaw Clyde Chestnut Barrow's extradition from Ohio to Texas, and the courtroom proceedings of Rudolph Valentino's manager, George Ullman. By May 16th, George Ullman's hearing on charges of fraud and mismanagement brought against him by Alberto Valentino was finally underway, and the press was hot on the story. Their early coverage reported how the court ordered George temporarily removed as executor, pending the outcome of the hearing. In his absence, A.P. Giannini's Bank of Italy was appointed administrator of the Valentino estate. George anticipated his temporary dismissal and Giannini's appointment, but Frank Manillo was livid, hearing that his arch-enemy was assuming authority over Rudy's estate. Frank and George were not the only people impacted by the court's initial orders. The judge also specified the suspension of all disbursement of estate funds, including Alberto's weekly stipend of $100, until a verdict was issued. This was not welcome news for Alberto, as he had grown accustomed to receiving George's regular weekly payments. With estate funds frozen for the duration of the court proceedings, Alberto would be forced to live solely on his modest salary from his office job at MGM Studios. With the exception of the attorneys, his lawsuit against George was about to become a financial strain on everyone involved. Just prior to the first day of court testimony, George was notified that court-appointed accountant Harry Baskerville's audit found no errors or discrepancies in his estate ledgers. When Alberto's attorneys received the results of Baskerville's report, they shifted the focus of their lawsuit from the examination of George's books to the legal definition of his authority. If Alberto could not prove George mismanaged the estate, he would attempt to prove he managed it without the proper authority. As court proceedings got underway, George resigned himself to making the daily trek across Los Angeles to the county courthouse to defend his actions. On the morning of May 15th, he was sworn to tell the whole truth and nothing but, and settled in to spend the remainder of the day on the witness stand. The courtroom was filled to capacity with reporters and spectators, waiting for George's attorney Leonard Wilson to cease in his pacing and get down to the business of the day. From his seat on the witness stand, George eyed Alberto's lawyers across the courtroom. He reminded himself that the slick team of Scarborough, Mann, and Sumner were not his real adversaries, for these men were just the latest hired guns of Alberto Valentino and his behind-the-scenes financial backer, Joe Schenck. When Attorney Wilson finally approached the witness stand, he took a deep breath and began his line of questioning. Mr. Ullman, what was your capacity in connection with your employment, if there was any employment, between yourself and Rudolph Valentino at the time of his death? George cleared his throat. I was Mr. Valentino's personal representative and business manager. At the time of Mr. Valentino's death, I knew the exact condition of the affairs and his finances, so far as he was concerned, as far as the productions were concerned. I was the only one that did know. Now, Mr. Ullman, Wilson continued, what did you do in connection with the showing or causing to be shown, and any other activities in connection with the disposition, the distribution, and later the showing of Valentino's two pictures, The Son of the Sheik and The Eagle, after the death of Rudolph Valentino? George hesitated for a moment before responding. It was my job to exploit these films and pay off the indebtedness. I also had the task of disposing of my friend's personal effects. He had about $16,000 worth of hardware, which he collected as souvenirs, swords, armor, and the like. It cost me $35,000 to fix up the legends and publicize this stuff, but I sold it for $97,000, and I was criticized for spending this $35,000 too. He paused again to collect his thoughts before he continued. In the first place, I began the memorial associations and corresponded with, I would estimate between 35,000 and 40,000 people over a period of 2 years. I answered every inquiry and maintained contact with all fans, with all the admirers of Valentino, just exactly as I did before his death. In fact, I laid more stress, gave these letters more personal attention than I did before his death. Before his death, we were accustomed to sending out form letters with fan pictures. After his death, I sent out personal letters and pictures. I had motion picture slides made, which I distributed throughout the world to picture theater owners. I addressed all picture theater owners of this country, asking them to secure members of the Valentino Memorial Association. George glanced up at the courtroom clock and proceeded to elaborate. I am trying to group the things that I did in as orderly a way as I can in order not to make my statement too long. My only purpose after Rudy's death was to perpetuate his name, first, because, as I stated before, of my friendship for him, my love for him, and second of all, because I wanted his pictures to be shown, because, prior to this time, no pictures had ever been shown beyond a time after a man's death. I knew of the difficulties which lay in the way of public opinion. The public's mind forgets people that have been great celebrities. They are forgotten, except in retrospective. I may say I proceeded to operate exactly as I had before his death, with the one exception of not attempting to obtain further employment for him. I kept his pictures alive and exploited and promoted interest of the pictures just exactly as if he had been alive. Leonard Wilson's direct examination of his client then shifted to the situation George faced in New York City following Rudy's death. George replied, I had to overcome the argument of the church as to the mode of burial. I had to engage policemen to keep order in the mob that congregated everywhere. I had between 35 and 40 newspaper reporters constantly around me, and kept them supplied with stories and things to keep them going. Reacting to a ripple of interest in the courtroom, Wilson raised his voice to ask, The body lay in state back there for a while? Yes, sir. How long? The body lay in state, open to the public, for about 2 days, and then we held the body for 6 days, contrary to the law of New York, in order to give Rudy's brother an opportunity to see the body before it was buried. Wilson turned to face the court before he asked his next question. What was the first thing the brother said to you upon his arrival? George's answer inspired another buzz throughout the courtroom. He wanted to know how much the estate would amount to. Alberto's attorney, James C. Scarborough, was on his feet demanding at top volume that George's last answer be stricken from the record. George's days on the witness stand left him little time to devote to his S. George Allman agency. He did his best, however, to spend as many early morning hours in his office as possible before his daily court appearances. Despite a bleak national economic situation, he managed to secure steady work for the actors he represented, which by 1930 included John Carradine and Frank Orth. He even found a few roles for his 3 children as extras in Eddie Cantor's Kid Millions, and cast his 6-year-old son Bobby in Herbert Brennan's first talking film, Lummox. On one of those early mornings, George sat at his desk wrapping up the day's business before the drive downtown to the courthouse. He plopped his fedora on his head, leaned back in his chair, and pulled open the desk drawer to slip a few files off his desk. He paused for a moment and fumbled through the drawer's narrow space until he found a small packet of letters tied with a piece of string. George had salvaged these letters in a sentimental moment while conducting the inventory of Rudy's estate. He untied the string, flipped it on the desk, and opened one of the envelopes. In measured handwriting, Rudy had written this particular love letter to Natasha in French. George held the letter for a few minutes before realizing time was running short. He would soon be summoned back to the witness stand. Facing another full day in court, he refolded the precious correspondence and slid it into its envelope. He then tucked the letters safely in the back of his desk drawer. That day, Rudy's sister Maria Estrada was scheduled to testify, and her appearance would provide George with a break in his lengthy testimony. Maria returned to Los Angeles from Italy on April 23rd, with the sole purpose of testifying on her brother Alberto's behalf. She traveled from Turin to dispute George's claim that he had authorized the loan of estate funds to Frank Manillo. George and Maria held opposing views of what transpired between them during her previous visit to Los Angeles in 1927. They both agreed they held a meeting at the Rudolph Valentino production prop house on Santa Monica Boulevard. But George claimed during this meeting she granted him permission to financially assist Frank Manillo. Maria alleged the opposite. George maintained he loaned Frank the $40,000 upon Maria Estrada's personal directive. He also claimed that as head of Rudolph Valentino Productions, he was authorized to invest estate profits to generate future income for the estate. In his defense, George presented as evidence to the court the original letter handwritten by Maria, in which she requested he assist Frank Manillo upon his return to Los Angeles. The letter, dated December 1st, 1927, read in part, quote, "As it is natural that his expenses shall not be supported by him, I would be very grateful to you if you would give him directly on account of me how much he will ask you for," end quote. George believed her request was outlined clearly in this letter. Maria and her brother Alberto thought differently. Alberto maintained that despite what his sister expressed in her note, George, as executor, should have obtained the court's permission for the loan. According to Alberto, because George lacked the authority to make the loan, he, not Frank Manillo, should be held responsible to reimburse the estate for the full amount. Consequently, when George took the witness stand, Alberto's attorney James Scarborough questioned him at length about the details of the Manillo loan and challenged the authenticity of Frank's receipts for George's checks. Scarborough also informed the judge that Frank Manillo was to have been subpoenaed to appear in court that day, but could not be located. It would be up to George to explain the situation from the witness stand. There were several elements that entered into my loaning Frank Manillo this money. In the first place, I relate a great deal upon the knowledge I had of his previous friendship for Valentino. In the second place, I thought that the business venture was extremely good, would turn out to be a profitable one, which I still think it will be. In the third place, I always presumed that I was conducting the corporation and therefore had the power to loan out funds that had accumulated. I wanted to make money for the corporation so that I could make pictures. In the fourth place, I relate a great deal upon the representations of the fact that he was here in Maria's stead. I believe that he was. He had her power of attorney. At least I was told so. Maria Estrada was summoned to the witness stand to respond to James Scarborough's questions. After your first arrival in Los Angeles in 1927, Mrs. Estrada, did you meet George Allman? Yes, on January 13, 1927. Did you have a talk with him at that meeting? Yes, sir. Do you recall meeting Mr. Ullman at a house here in Los Angeles where some of your brother's property was stored? Yes, I remember. Did you have a conversation with Mr. Ullman at that time? Did you talk with Mr. Ullman? I talked, yes, about the property, about the souvenirs, the swords, the personal property of my brother, and I chose some personal property. Did you also meet George Ullman at his house during that visit, at his residence? Yes. Mrs. Estrada, during your visit to Los Angeles in 1927, did you and Mr. Ullman ever have a conversation about Frank Manillo? Yes. Did Mr. Ullman have anything to say in that conversation about Mr. Manillo? Yes. He said he was a fine man, a very good friend of my brother, that Mr. Ullman expressed all his highly estimation and affection for Mr. Manillo. Leonard Wilson then began his cross-examination. I will ask you, Mrs. Estrada, if you do not remember at that property house, in the presence of S. George Ullman and one other witness, whose name you can now not recall, if you did not state that you had appointed Mr. Manillo to represent you, and that he would come out here and straighten out the trouble that your brother Alberto was causing. Maria shot a furtive glance across the courtroom at James Scarborough. He nodded and she continued, I never say anything of the kind to Mr. Ullman. George was then summoned back to the witness stand, reminded that he was still under oath, and asked for more details about the meeting in question. Who all was present? Nobody was there but Lou Mahoney, Maria Estrada, and I. State what was said in reference to Frank Manillo. Maria Estrada told me at the time that she met Frank Manillo in New York. He had taken her to an attorney whose name was William Grossman, that she wanted Frank Manillo to come here and represent her interests, whatever they may be in the estate. She stated she had implicit faith in Manillo and that he would be here at her expense, that I was to give him whatever he may ask for in connection with her share of the estate. Under redirect by James Scarborough, Maria acknowledged she guessed this conversation took place, and she was then asked about her receipt of the many cash advances issued by George Ullman. Now, will you state to the court what money you have received from the estate? I received on March 21, 1927, a draft on the Wilshire National Bank for $5,000. When I was myself in Los Angeles, and from personal property at the same time for $3,428, and when I was back in Italy, I received 4 cashier checks from Mr. Allman for $1,000 each on the Pan American Bank. At what point did you receive the $4,000? I received May 4th, 1928, being myself in Italy. You were in Italy then? Yes, sir. You got the checks from George Ullman through the mail then? Yes. If there was one subject that rankled Alberto Valentino, it was the fact that George Ullman continued to draw a regular paycheck of $400 a week from Rudolph Valentino Productions during his first 2 years as executor. Under George's original contract, signed in 1923, Rudy agreed to pay George $1,400 a week. But Rudolph Valentino Productions ledgers reveal Rudy's manager was seldom paid more than $400 a week. It was for this reason that after Rudy's death, George continued to draw his $400 a week paycheck. At this rate of pay, his salary for his first 2 years as executor would have totaled just over $40,000. When he submitted a claim to the court for half of this at $22,300, his authority to do so came under heavy fire from Alberto's attorney James Scarborough, who opened his line of questioning concerning George's paychecks by asking, "You state on page 6 of your account, Mr. Allman, that from the date of the death of the deceased, Rudolph Valentino, until on or about the 13th day of November 1928, you advanced to yourself the sum of $22,300. Is that correct?" George nodded and replied, "Yes. When I first took over the estate and the corporation and attempted to make something out of it, I went to Rudy's attorney, Mr. W.I. Gilbert, and I asked him point blank. I told him, rather, that this would take all of my time, that I would have to work harder than I ever did before. I asked Mr. Gilbert whether he thought it would be correct for me to draw a salary. He said he did not see any reason why I should not. He told me that other attorneys acting for the heirs did not object to the payment to me of $30,000 for my services up to that date, and therefore I would receive 10% of all other monies that would be brought into the estate by my efforts." Scarborough turned to address the judge. "If the court please, we ask that this witness's statement be stricken as purely hearsay." The judge denied his request by saying, "You asked him why he did so, why he took the salary. We do not need any argument. He stated his reason for doing so." After muttering, "All right, I have no further questions," James Scarborough returned to his seat. To corroborate George's statement that he drew his salary upon the advice of Rudy's attorney, W.I. Gilbert was called to the witness stand to recall his conversation with George. He testified, "Well, Mr. Ullman outlined in a general way some things that he had been doing for the estate to build up its value, and inquired of me as to the compensation for himself. He stated he was doing a great many things that as executor he did not think he was supposed to do, and asked me if the court would allow him compensation for that. I told him that unquestionably the court would allow him additional compensation. He asked me then if the court would allow him the same amount of pay that he had drawn from Mr. Valentino in his lifetime. I told him I couldn't say to that, but I thought if the services were the same as in Mr. Valentino's lifetime, that this would be very persuasive to the court." Gilbert continued with his testimony. "I don't know whether I should make this statement or not, but I'm going to make it, and they can strike it out. It has been generally known that the death of a star practically destroyed the value of any existing pictures." James Scarborough shouted another objection. "We move to strike that answer out." George's attorney Leonard Wilson interrupted Scarborough to address the judge. "Your Honor, we think Mr. Gilbert ought to be allowed to finish his statement." The judge asked Gilbert if his statement would have a conclusion. "Yes, Your Honor," Gilbert testified. "Well, at any rate, I know that Mr. Allman put in a very large effort in merchandising the Valentino productions after his death, both in correspondence, advertising, and boosting, so as to keep the value of those screens up in spite of his death. W.I. Gilbert had represented Rudolph Valentino in one capacity or another for nearly a decade, and his appearance in the courtroom and his testimony carried substantial weight. As he stepped down from the witness stand, he gave a slight nod to George. Whether his words of support would have any sway over the court and spare George's neck remained to be seen. In 1930, most 12-year-old boys know plenty about the good guys and the bad guys after reading cops and robbers adventure stories in popular pulp magazines such as The Black Mask and Dragnet. Authors of these magazines' articles did a remarkable job of defining good from evil for their adolescent audience. Unfortunately for George Allman's eldest son, Dan, when it came to the subjects of unauthorized loans and disbursements of estate funds, differentiating good from evil was not so black and white. Dan Allman was a typical 12-year-old, and his simplistic definitions of hero and villain made it difficult for him to comprehend his father's legal problems. His parents assured him he had nothing to worry about, but Dan suffered from an active imagination and feared his dad might be headed for jail. Unlike his little brother Bobby and his baby sister Bunny, Dan remembered his favorite Uncle Rudy. His young mind raced as he read the front page headlines being printed about his father. Kin accuse executor for Valentino. Valentino estate fraud charges, oust executor. And ballyhoo for Valentino funeral told in court. Dan struggled to understand just what the trouble was between his father and Uncle Rudy's brother. His dad endeavored to explain the situation point by telling his son that what the press called ballyhoo was a reference to his efforts to promote Uncle Rudy's films and keep his name profitable for his estate. But Dan needed more of an explanation and quizzed his parents at length. No matter what answers they gave him, he remained focused on one thought. His dad went to court every day to prove to the world that he was not a crook. The lengthy court proceedings were not the only thing exacting an emotional toll on the Ullman family. Facing the steep price of his legal representation, George was forced to sell his Foothill Road home and move his family into a rented home on Linden Drive. He also decided he would not wait for the court to reinstate him as executor upon the conclusion of the hearing, and on July 7th, he tendered his formal resignation. He believed he would soon be exonerated on every charge brought against him by Alberto. His executor's accounts would finally be approved by the court, and he would then be free to move on with his life and career. George told the press he resigned as executor to prevent, quote, discord from clouding the memory of my dear friend. This was well intended, but wishful thinking on George's behalf. The memory of his dear friend was already rife with discord, and George Allman's resignation as executor did not prevent him from facing considerable more time on the witness stand. When did you start west with the body of Rudolph Valentino? I believe it was 9 days later, George testified. I think it was the 1st of September. You brought the body directly to Los Angeles, his attorney asked. Yes, sir. What sort of accommodations did you provide? We had a private car. In fact, we had 2 private cars for which we did not pay anything except at the regular rate of passenger service. I had previously arranged by wire all the details of the funeral here. And the body was brought here? Yes, George shifted in his seat. The body was brought here and taken off at an outlying station, and services were held at Beverly Hills. Subsequently, the body was placed in a crypt in the Hollywood Cemetery, the crypt not being the property of the estate. It was a borrowed crypt from a friend of Valentino. Wilson paused in his pacing and turned to ask George, Now, why did you conduct this ceremony, I will call it, for want of anything better to think of now, why did you conduct this ceremony in the manner that you did in the city of New York? I did that in order to obtain international publicity for the name of Valentino, and further the sales of his pictures, which I knew he had, well, the corporation had an interest in. What corporation do you mean? Rudolph Valentino Productions. After your return to Los Angeles and this funeral that was conducted in the manner that you just testified, what did you do in reference to the formation and organization of the Rudolph Valentino Memorial Association? I wrote to people whose names I had from previous correspondence and fan mail, asking their cooperation in keeping Rudy's name alive, even though he had passed away, and I instructed them that the only way to keep the name alive was to apply to see his pictures at various theaters, wherever they may be. The result was the formation of Valentino Memorial Clubs throughout the world. I estimate there must have been 65 or 70 of them, the majority of which I am the president of. They have conducted services annually, and during the year have gone to theaters insisting on seeing Valentino's pictures, especially the last 2. That was the thing I asked them to do. What were these last pictures? Wilson asked. The Eagle and the Son of the Sheik. Wilson pressed on by asking for details of George's efforts to promote Rudy's name in the days following his death. Immediately upon the conclusion of the services for Valentino, George testified, I had an expert make a catalog for the purpose of holding an auction, a public auction, and advertise this auction in the same manner as a performance, as a show would be advertised, in order to get the interested people of Los Angeles to come to the sale. Did you build a stage there? Wilson asked. I built a stage and had spotlights. I had various other things, such as a number of policemen guarding the property, and for the effect it would produce. The judge then interrupted Attorney Wilson, saying he wished to ask George a question. Mr. Allman, the judge inquired, as long as you have described in a word the affair in New York as having been staged for the benefit of publicity, it may be personal curiosity on my part, but I'd like to know if the performance here was also staged, his burial and funeral. George turned to face the judge. In a manner it was, yes, sir, because I arranged all of these things that happened by wire, by telegram from New York. I had people here working with me all the time. You mean for its effect on sentimental people? George answered the judge by facing the spectators in the courtroom. It was not only for that. It was natural because I wanted to give Valentino, who is not only a business associate, but a very dear personal friend of mine, I wanted to give him the finest funeral I knew how to give. In November, Falcon Laird's ex-handyman, Lou Mahoney, was subpoenaed to testify on George's behalf. At the time of his impending testimony, Lou was operating a dry cleaning business on Highland Avenue. This was the same business previously owned by Rudy and known as Ritz Cleaners. Because the business was an asset of Rudy's estate at the time of his death, the Ritz Cleaners' financial accounts, as well as the details of the transference of its ownership to Lou Mahoney, received a thorough going over by the court during the court proceedings of Guglielmi v. Allman. When George delivered his testimony regarding the cleaning business, he stated it was sometime after the San Francisco estate auction in January 1927 that he cleared the dry cleaners nearly $3,000 of debt and appointed Lou in charge. By March of that same year, George said he officially signed ownership of the business over to Lou. He then sold the business to Lou for $250. Despite this testimony, Lou would later claim George gave him the business along with a company truck on the agreement that he reimbursed the estate the $250 whenever he could afford to do so. Lou apparently ran the business for a few years, for in 1930, when a census taker knocked on his front door, he reported his occupation as dry cleaner. In the days prior to Lou's November courtroom appearance, he was following every detail of George Allman's legal travails as covered in the local papers. At the same time, Lou was also perusing news reports of another courtroom drama involving another of his past employers, Inspector Thomas J. Kelly. Before Lou moved to Los Angeles from New York City, he served 7 years on the New York City police force with Inspector Kelly's 12th Inspection Division in Queens. Described as one public official who could not be touched, Inspector Thomas J. Kelly was no stranger to courtroom showdowns. While Lou was a member of the infamous precinct, Inspector Kelly and several of his officers were charged on multiple occasions with lax enforcement of prohibition laws, covert relationships with local bootleggers and speakeasies, evidence tampering, and the stashing of ill-gotten gains in small tin boxes. In November of 1930, Lou was reading all about it. Inspector Kelly and his gang were once again in trouble with the law. It seemed retired Judge Samuel Seabury's investigation of the New York City police involved many of Lou's old precinct buddies. On this occasion, Inspector Kelly and Lou's cohorts were accused of incarcerating women and extorting money from them on trumped-up charges. As Lou was reading the latest testimony from his fellow officers in New York, he faced his own imminent day in court where he would deliver testimony in Alberto's lawsuit against George Ullman. When Lou took the witness stand, he was asked to elaborate upon the events immediately following his famous employer's sudden death. State what you saw at this time. I seen the big staff working in the office all the time up at the house, inventorying the estate. Were you present at any of these sales? They handled them all. What did Mr. Ullman do at these sales? Supervised the entire work of the sale. Was he the one that built the stage out there? No, sir. Did he order it built? He ordered everything pertaining to the sale handled. Lew continued his testimony by stating that he first met Rudolph Valentino in November of 1925. Whether this was a slip of the gruff young Irishman's tongue or perjury, Lew actually met Valentino 1 year earlier in the fall of 1924. Nevertheless, he informed the courtroom that Mr. Allman worked hard, and after Mr. Valentino's death, he ensured that everyone working for Rudolph Valentino Productions, quote, was fed and paid, end quote. Attorney Wilson closed his line of questioning by asking Lew precisely what Mr. Alberto Valentino was doing during this same time frame. Lew replied, nothing. His answer prompted another objection from Attorney James Scarborough. Late on the afternoon of November 12th, courtroom reporters clock-watched, slumped in their seats, and scribbled half-heartedly on their notepads. Leonard Wilson seemed to sense they needed something to pique their interest, and produced 2 blank checks signed by Rudolph Valentino. Everyone in the courtroom had witnessed Rudolph Valentino's signature on many documents during the prolonged hearing, but they still craned their necks for a better look. The judge gave each check a closer scrutiny, and then asked Wilson why he wished these 2 particular documents to be tagged as evidence. Leonard Wilson explained these checks were in George Allman's possession, and if he had intended to loot the Valentino estate, he could have done it easily by simply filling out Valentino's blank notes for any amount the estate could pay. Wilson then described how Valentino gave the blank checks to George in February of 1926. George Allman kept these signed note forms all these 4 years he was working to build up the estate for the heirs, who are now attacking his reputation. The judge denied the admission of the blank notes by stating, Mr. Ullman has already demonstrated to the court that he is a very competent man with figures and accounts. As an appointee of the court, he comes before the court with all the presumption of integrity. The court proceedings continued to drag on into December, when the judge made the announcement to adjourn until January. Before leaving the courtroom for the holiday break, George made a startling revelation to the court from the witness stand, when he alleged that a document of the utmost importance was stolen from Valentino's safe. He explained his claim by saying this document should have been attached to the original copy of Valentino's will. George went on to state how this paper supported his claim Valentino directed him to act both as executor and as head of the production company. He added that prior to Valentino's death, his will was kept in his Falcon Lair office safe, and only 3 people knew the combination to that safe: Rudolph Valentino, his brother Alberto, and Lou Mahoney. Reporters smelled a juicy headline, and the next morning the public read all about the document's mysterious disappearance and the rifling of Valentino's safe. There was not much the court could do to resolve the issue of the missing portion of the will, and on the day before the holiday recess, testimony was focused instead upon the subject of the transference of Cosmic Arts Incorporated stock at the time of Rudy and Natasha's divorce. But with everyone's minds on Christmas and the New Year, the judge decided to postpone this line of questioning until after the holidays. His last order of business was to order the lawyer who handled the Valentino's divorce, Raymond Stewart, to submit a copy of the Valentino's property settlement for his review when the court reconvened at the end of January. It was only a few days after the court adjourned that George answered his office telephone to hear attorney Raymond Stewart's voice on the line. Stewart asked George if he was sitting down. "What the hell's going on, Ray?" George asked. Stewart sounded out of breath. "You'll never guess what I just found in Rudy's divorce file." "Go on," George replied. "A beat-up carbon copy of those instructions Rudy left for you," Stewart said with a snort of disbelief. George was already reaching for his hat. I'll be right over. Within a half an hour, George was standing in Raymond Stewart's office holding a tattered and smudged sheet of onion skin paper which read, quote, "To S. George Ullman, I have this day named you as executor in my last will and testament. It is my desire that you perpetuate my name in the picture industry by continuing Rudolph Valentino Productions Incorporated until my nephew Gene shall have reached the age of 25 years. In the meantime, to make motion pictures, using your own judgment as to numbers and kind, keeping control of my pictures made, if possible. Whenever there are profits from pictures made by the Rudolph Valentino Productions Incorporated, it is my wish that you will pay my brother Alberto the sum of $400 monthly, to my sister Maria the sum of $200 monthly, and to my dear friend Mrs. Warner the sum of $200 monthly. When my nephew Gene reaches the age of 25 years, I desire that the residue, if any, be given to him. In the event of his death, then the residue shall be distributed equally to my sister Maria and my brother Alberto." End quote. George read and then reread the document. Here, on the thin carbon copy, were Rudy's instructions exactly as he remembered them, with one significant and glaring exception. The only instruction George had no recollection of ever receiving from Rudy was the bombshell that he never left his estate in a three-way split between his brother, sister, and Teresa Warner, but had instead bequeathed everything to his nephew Gene. Raymond Stewart's legal mind was already in high gear. "This means," he said, "that the only way Alberto and Maria could ever have any legal share in Rudy's estate beyond that stipend would be in the eventuality of Gene's death before he turned 25. Good Lord, George, this could present a serious problem for you as far as the cash advances to Alberto, Maria, and Teresa Warner are concerned." George began grasping precisely what the attorney was saying. "You mean that Alberto and Maria have no future share in the estate as long as Gene is alive?" "Precisely, George. The money you advance to them cannot be deducted from their share in the estate because they have none. Except for their weekly stipend checks, you had no authority to advance them a penny or give them any estate items. Past those weekly stipends, it all belongs to Gene." George's initial elation upon hearing of the document's discovery was fading fast into grave concern. He stared at the document and was not surprised to see that Rudy signed the document the same day he signed his will, September 1st, 1925. But when he read the name of the document's sole witness, he was dumbstruck. Luther H. Mahoney. As Raymond Stewart rambled on with more legal ramifications of the incredible find, George remained fixated on Lou Mahoney's signature. Raymond Stewart droned on with his legal analysis as it dawned on George that Lou had known all along that Rudy had endorsed this sheet of instructions as a valid second page to his will. Why, George thought, while he sought so desperately for any proof of this document's existence for 4 long years, had Lou not come forward, and why had he said absolutely nothing? George handed the sheet of paper back to Raymond Stewart and mumbled that he had an errand to run. Before Raymond Stewart could say another word, George was out the door, headed for his car. With his hands gripping the steering wheel, he sped along the streets of Los Angeles, taking the Lord's and Handyman Lou's names in vain. Thanks for listening, and my next installment will be Chapter 9, titled A Mineralava Country Mile. I hope you will subscribe to this podcast so you will be notified when the next chapter goes online. As always, you may find your copy of Affairs Valentino on Amazon and all online book-selling venues.